I'm Jonathan Brent. I'm the executive director of the YIVO Institute, the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. And it is a tremendous pleasure to stand before you, to welcome our many visitors from abroad, to welcome the director and the creator of this film, many distinguished guests. Tonight we are going to see the U.S. premiere of Killing Kasztner, the Jew who dealt with the Nazis. It's a film that's produced by Gaylen Ross, and it's received not just critical acclaim, it's received a bounty of acclaim, a riot of acclaim practically in those places where it has been seen, because this is one of the great, mysterious, extraordinary events of World War II and the Jewish catastrophe of World War II. And Gaylen worked for 8 years on the making of this film with a kind of love and care and intelligence that you will witness this evening, and I think find quite extraordinary. Ms. Ross chose YIVO for the premiere because of the special connection that YIVO has to the Holocaust. YIVO Institute, as some of you know, but perhaps not all of you, was founded in actually Berlin in 1925, but then moved to Vilna. So YIVO has a special relationship to this history. And in particular, within the past year, our institute has received an unusual and most important collection of papers about Kasztner from Professor Egon Meyer, whose parents were passengers on one of the Kasztner trains. And now onto the program. I would like to introduce Professor Ronald Zweig, who will make opening remarks about the film.
Thank you, Jonathan. Ambassador Shalev, Ambassador Sharif, to the Kasztner family, ladies and gentlemen, I have always considered Rezso Kasztner to be one of the heroes of the Jewish resistance to the Nazis during the Second World War. And I was honored to receive the invitation to participate this evening. I was doubly honored when I had an opportunity to see the documentary in advance of this evening that you are about to see. It is a remarkable achievement by Gaylen Ross, and I say that as a historian who struggles not only to research and write about the past, but also to teach it and to communicate it to students. And the documentary is not only a documentary about the fate of Hungarian Jewry and the particular and heroic role of Kasztner in attempting to rescue Hungarian Jewry. It is also a documentary about Israeli society at a very particular moment, a brief moment in history. Israel, in the late 1940s, the Yishuv, and Israel, during the 1950s, and until the Eichmann trial, 1961, the capture of Eichmann, and 1962, Eichmann's trial and execution, was a society that was deeply ambivalent in its attitudes to the Holocaust, to the fate of European Jewry, and to the survivors. You are all familiar with the accusation, that terrible and grossly misinformed accusation of lambs to the slaughter. This was particularly applied to Hungarian Jewry, who it was felt should have known better, had the opportunity to revolt, but didn't. And this is something that certainly colored Israeli attitudes to the fate of Hungarian Jewry. There was also a widely felt sentiment that the real Holocaust was the fate of Polish Jewry, and that the Hungarians should have done, in fact, what the Poles did in the Warsaw Ghetto, a mass revolt. If the Poles could do it, surely the Hungarians should have done the same. It was also believed that the only thing that really mattered about the fate of, or the Hungarian resistance to the Nazis, was what the parachutists sent from the Yishuv did. So the true heroism of the resistance to the Hungarian phase of the Holocaust actually belonged to the Yishuv and not to the leaders of the Hungarian Jewish community. And in general, after the victories of 1948 and 1949, it was the struggles of the Yishuv against its opponents that were the true measure of Jewish heroism. And in that mindset, there was very little room for sympathy or understanding for the fate of Hungarian Jewry. In addition, it is difficult to understand today the frightening politicization of Holocaust memory in Israel between right and left. The opposition to the Mapai ruling party, ruling political establishment in Israel, used anything possible to attack the government and the Holocaust, and the role of the Mapai leadership of the Yishuv during the years of the Holocaust were as good a weapon as any to achieve the political goals of the 1950. And one thing that this documentary, I think, illustrates brilliantly is how a revisionist politician, Shmuel Tamir, and an anti-establishment journalist, Uri Avneri, actually turn the trial against Grunwald and the attempt to defend Kasztner against the Grunwald libel, turned it into an attack on the Israeli political leadership. But Mapai was deeply conflicted about its own role in the Holocaust. The accusation had been made that the political leadership of the Yishuv had opted to advance the struggle for Jewish independence, and they did so by cooperating with the Allied war aims, and that this was done at the expense of the Jews of Europe. This is another grossly misinformed accusation that was widely current in Israel. Ben-Gurion himself was extremely sensitive to the accusation that the Yishuv had turned its back on European Jewry, and it is only recent historical scholarship that has finally debunked this accusation. The Yishuv was deeply engaged in attempts, all of them illicit, all of them illegal, given Allied war aims and given Allied requirements of no contact with the enemy, no negotiations, and no succor to be sent to Europe. So all of the Yishuv's attempts to maintain communications with Jews in Europe, to negotiate deals with Nazis or their sympathizers were deeply illegal and, in fact, treasonable, and therefore were not talked about. The result was an impression that the Yishuv had been, under the leadership of Mapai, had been divorced from the fate of European Jewry, and this was something to which the Mapai leadership felt extremely sensitive toward. We must also recognize that the events of the 1950s, the trial, the appeal to the trial, and the assassination, the murder of Kasztner, take place just a few short years after Israel and the Jewish world's negotiations of a reparations agreement, reparations, restitution, and indemnification agreement with West Germany in 1952. This had been the occasion of violent attacks against the Mapai government, attacks even against the Knesset in Jerusalem, and there was great sensitivity to all consideration of any attempts to restitute Jewish property and dealing with the Nazis. And this touches on something very central in the Kasztner story. As you will see, Gaylen Ross understood this in her documentary and in the discussion with an Israeli historian, Shoshana Ishoni Bari, the story of Kasztner's role in assisting the Yishuv to reclaim the property of Hungarian Jewry that had been paid to Kurt Becher as a bribe in the course of 1944 was absolutely central to his role in Europe and his defense or purported defense of Becher for activities that he was instructed to do by the leadership of the Yishuv and for which he paid a very serious price. One final comment, I'd like to draw your attention to Judge Benjamin Halevi and his role in his attack on Kasztner. It is a key stage in this story. One asks the question, what is the basis for Halevi's animosity to Kasztner and to the political establishment of which Kasztner was a part, to Mapai? He had a particular animosity to Ben-Gurion. The answer to that is perhaps a piece of historical trivia, but nevertheless it had terrible consequences. Ben-Gurion had blocked Halevi, who was the chief of the district court of Jerusalem, had blocked his promotion to the Supreme Court, and I believe a large part of Halevi's attack on Kasztner can be seen as an attack on Ben-Gurion and a petty act of revenge. I hope I have helped situate the movie. We are about to see, I think, a remarkable documentary and a remarkable achievement in historical reconstruction. My question to the panel is this: there are no longer any serious historians who doubt the justice of Kasztner's cause. He is widely recognized as a major rescuer and a very brave figure in the sad history of the Hungarian Holocaust. Is this film necessary today? Has the battle, is it still necessary to fight this battle to rehabilitate the name of Kasztner, or are we not simply preaching to the converted?
I would say absolutely the contrary. I would say that the Kasztner is still a flashpoint for people who want to believe what they want to believe, and they will believe it forever no matter what, and they could be watching this film and reading every book for the next 50 years, and they will still hold the same values and the feelings about Kasztner. I would say to you this: where is Kasztner on the walls of the museums? Where is Kasztner in the films? Where is Kasztner in our literature? I don't see him here. I don't see him. I can tell you that we went to Israel and filmed, and young people said, yes, I know Hannah Senesh, we don't know Kasztner. So it may be that those people who are reading books know Kasztner.
The story of Kasztner's heroism shouldn't be just a part of the history books. So, it should be part of, I think, every person's life. The concept of heroism, that it doesn't always at the end of a barrel of the gun. And I think it should be taught in every school, in every kindergarten, and given Kasztner as an example, how a person can use his personality, his wits, and still be a great hero and save many lives.
I think the rehabilitation is needed only in certain areas where it's still needed, but mostly I think Kasztner is not known well enough. I mean, too many people do not know the name, do not know about the deeds, do not know about the rescue, and if to add to what my mother's just said, for me, the most important lesson from what he did was that he wasn't a victim in the Holocaust, that is. He chose to do something where it seemed as if there was nothing that could have been done. And he still chose to try and do the most far-fetched, crazy, impossible, weird thing, but still, to try and do something for himself and for others. And I think this is something that should be worldwide known.
Thank you. Rezso.
I hope I'm not putting my foot in it, being a foreigner from England. But when I was first starting to work on this book, Rezso Kasztner, the daring rescue of Hungarian Jews, very largely autobiographical, I thought, what have I got to say? I was 11 years old. What are my memories? It's nothing. It was trivial compared with something great. And then I noticed that I was part of something great, thanks to Rezso. But I noticed since, from the reactions that I've been getting in England, that there is an even bigger question involved there. When I get hate mail, not very often, but I do sometimes, I'm being told you survived because 400,000 died. I expect it, so it doesn't upset me very much. But I see how that is then wrongly extrapolated against the whole of Zionism, totally undistinguished. Zionism on the left, Zionism on the right, doesn't matter. Zionism is dirty, Israel is dirty, and you get a lot of that in England and elsewhere. And I would say that perhaps if we could, you have to start somewhere, and if we start with Kasztner to give a differentiated picture, yes, indeed, we still do need it very much.
Okay, and Mr. Bishop.
I agree with Lotzi. There are Holocaust deniers, there are Kasztner deniers. People have been interviewed in Israel and they don't remember anything about the case or something wrong. You can ask a lot of people in the United States and they don't know anything about World War II, not to speak about World War I. I think more has been accomplished in the past 5 or 10 years rehabilitating Kasztner than in the previous 41, and therefore I feel that we have to relentlessly pursue books, meetings, and interviews like the one we have today.
Zsuzsi said something just now that heroism is does not only come from the barrel of a gun. Israeli society has idolized those Jews who fought with weapons against the Nazis. Mordechai Anilevich, Abba Kovner, Hannah Senish. These are the names that are remembered and taught in the schools. So my question now to the panel is Israel ready for a different conception of heroism? Gaylen.
Well, I don't think the question should be, is Israel ready? Is the world ready? I mean, we're all sitting at the barrel of a gun. I mean, we're in Afghanistan. It's not about a right war or a wrong war. But I think the problem is when we center this as a story about Israel, it is a story about Israel, but it's very much when I think the kids in Tel Aviv University are sitting there saying, you know, maybe we should learn something else. Maybe we should talk about another option. And Merav says it in the film. There should be other options. And I do think instead of focusing it so much on Israel, I think it's what every one of us is dealing with in the world. What do we do with our negotiators? We condemn them before they get to the table. We ridicule them. And then maybe they get to the table, but it's only after thousands of lives have been lost, countries devastated, and then they push themselves up to the conference table and they negotiate.
I'm sorry, I'm not such an optimist. I was 10 years ago or more when Rabin was negotiating for peace, but he too was assassinated, so I'm sorry, I'm not such an optimist in this area. But I think we should try and educate for it, and maybe sometime in the future we can achieve something through education. And telling the Kasztner story is going in the right direction, I think.
Merav?
I don't know if the world is ready, but, you know, why not do whatever we can to make it ready to accept this option?
Professor Lowe, is there a Kasztner model of bravery?
Yes, there is. I was introducing myself as an Englishman, which I'm not. I'm a Hungarian originally. And I find it very strange when people talk in actual Hungarian, who then became Swiss. And I find it strange when people talk about heroes or Helden, because to me, it is very much somebody who is aggressive, who fights with the sword or with machine guns. And I'm very impressed by something that Kasztner's nephew told, partly me personally, partly in an interview that I've read, Yitzhak Katzir, Zsuzsi's cousin, that Rezso told him once what kind of hero he considers himself. And he said that he was a hero of circumstances. And by that he meant that there was a situation, it was a desperate situation. Nobody was doing anything. Somebody, at least if he was that kind of person, had to do something. I don't think he started with first principles. I think one could almost say he was an existentialist hero. He just did something, he saved lives. And of course, I think one has to say that it's better to save lives than not to save lives.
Mr. Bishop.
I think that what we have to try and show the Israeli youth of what it meant to have guts in a situation that we were in. It's sort of easy to say that you guys went to your slaughter, you didn't do anything, when we were surrounded by the most powerful army of the world, one that has overrun all of Europe and half of the world. At this particular point, when the Germans came in, there was a total paralysis as far as the leadership is concerned, and nobody did anything. There was confusion, undescribable confusion, and this man had the guts and the courage to risk his own life and do whatever he did. He spoke to the SS, he negotiated a deal, he worked on several deals, he risked his own life, he went back to Germany. He could have, very simply, if he, that he's accused of having known and having hidden the truth. First of all, what he has known, everybody else knew. He could have gone to Kolozsvár, he could have grabbed a truck in the middle of the night, he had relations to the SS, he could have smuggled his family out, he has gotten out himself and would have been the end. but he showed courage, he showed leadership, he showed enterprise, and that is what I think we should somewhere along the line convey to the Israeli youth today.
Thank you.
Your first question was if it's necessary to speak about Kasztner after so many years. I think we owe Kasztner a rehabilitation because Wallenberg is everywhere as the hero. Wallenberg was a guy who had the backing of Roosevelt and had the backing of America and everybody. But our friend Kasztner had only himself as a helper. So I think we should rehabilitate, and the people should know that Kasztner existed. Thank you.
There were plans going on in Slovakia. There was Rabbi Weissmandl, Gizi Fleischmann, Zionist women, and there was a very fruitful but rather tragic misunderstanding. There was Eichmann's second in command, one of his henchmen, Vyslitseny, who bribed by the two Slovak Jews I've just mentioned, and led to believe that by giving them the money, giving Vyslitseny the money he did, they held up the deportations. In fact, it wasn't. It was politics. The Germans had reasons to do a favor to the Slovaks at that particular time. Anyway, when on that fateful 19th of March 1944, the Germans invaded their faithful allies, as they did, the Hungarian Vada, Kasztner and his friends, who were already helping refugees from others surrounding Hungary, were told by Weissmandl and Gizi Fleischmann, look, there is a possibility of doing business with the Nazis. And they also told Vyslitseny that there were certain Jewish leaders, or rather not unofficial, as you were saying, unofficial figures who took it on themselves to try and help, that a deal could be made with them. And that's how it all started.
I might add to that the rescue committee, Vadat Hatzalah, had been active for at least 2.5 years prior to the German invasion and had accumulated a lot of experience in bribing and dealing with German and Hungarian officials on the rescue of Jews at various different levels. And when the Germans invade in March 1944, they knew about the rescue committee and they immediately take them in and start dealing with them. They seek them out. So it's both sides knew each other in advance of the German invasion.
Was there anything in the archives to indicate why the other three Nazis got affidavits? And I was wondering how the panel feels how they can reconcile heroism with giving affidavits to these Nazis after the war.
I think what was happening was that Kasztner was hoping to achieve three things. One was catch Eichmann, who had disappeared, get back the Jewish assets, which had also disappeared, been spirited away, and I'd rather not speculate what happened to it. And the third thing, which seems trifling, but it wasn't all that trifling, he wanted to get the Mufti of Jerusalem, because the Nazis had promised the Mufti not to allow Jews into... he made an agreement an anti-Jewish agreement with the Nazis. It becomes a bit less certain, but very likely that Kasztner was under orders from higher up in the Yishuv in Mapai. Look, don't say anything. And I think these are my two explanations.
I think that two footnotes to this that are worth mentioning. Immediately at the end of the Second World War, there were a number of fantasies rife in the world about the value of Nazi gold stolen from the Jews, gold and diamonds, that the Nazis had hoarded and the Allies had captured. And there was a a behind-the-scenes struggle within the Jewish world. Who would claim these assets back? Would they be returned, those that had come from Hungary to Hungary, or would they be distributed to the world Jewish organizations? To give you a sense of the dimensions of these rumors, the New York Times published that the Hungarian gold train alone, which was only one of them, was worth $800 million in 1945 values, and that's billions in today's values. Of course, that's very, very far from the truth, but those were the rumors that were publicly distributed. Secondly, when Becher was arrested or shortly before Becher was arrested by the American Army, by American field intelligence, he handed over those assets that he had taken from the Jews, that Kasztner had paid him and he had obtained from other sources, boxes and boxes of cash and valuables. He handed it over to Moshe Schweiger, an associate of Kasztner's, and said, "These belong to the Jewish Agency and the American Joint Distribution Committee." And that was, that may be apocryphal, that story, but it was symbolic of the deal. If you look after me, I will repeat this story to the world, and this is your strongest claim to those assets. So in the end, it boils down to a fight over resources.
I want to add two things. One, to emphasize the thing that Shoshana Barry says, what she found in all her, she found papers showing that not only the Jewish Agency paid for his trip to Nuremberg and that they knew and they wanted him to give the affidavit, she also shows that people in the government, in the Jewish Agency, had completely independent contacts and relationships with Becher and with other ex-Nazis. She even says the sentence, they didn't need Kasztner. They were dealing with them on their own. That's the first thing, to get, you know, the whole Kasztner work for the Jewish Agency after the war in context. And the second thing is, I want to quote Professor Shlomo Aronson, a historian that has his theory that one of the reasons for Kasztner's motivation to go to Nuremberg and to give the affidavit is that what he says is in Nuremberg, the Holocaust of the Jewish people was not at all on the agenda. This was not something that they have discussed. They had their own issues with the Nazis. And what he thinks is that this was Kasztner's way to try and put the extermination of Jewish people on the agenda and to show that some Nazis, after all, and no matter if it was only for their best interest, chose to do something else, and that it was possible for Nazis not to participate all the way in the extermination.
I think we can end this part of the discussion by saying that there is now a consensus amongst historians dealing with the Hungarian Holocaust and the aftermath of the Holocaust in general that Kasztner was acting under instructions from the leadership of the Yishuv when he testified on behalf of Becher.
I think that the letter, the affidavit appeared. Kasztner panicked. I think it's absolutely right. He wasn't supposed to be on trial. He wasn't the defendant. This affidavit, how did his lawyer, it was Kasztner's lawyer, who had the affidavit, and Tamir, you have to give it to Tamir, who was a brilliant lawyer. He saw it, he knew what its value was, and he presented it. If, in fact, Kasztner was working for the Jewish Agency came in and said they denied knowing anything about it.
As I said in my opening remarks, we must remember the overall context. 2.5 years before the trial, there had been riots in Jerusalem. Right. The Knesset was under siege over the issue of, can you deal with the Germans, money, and so on. So these were extremely sensitive issues. I don't think Kasztner needed instructions not to talk about it. He understood it intuitively, that this is a matter that you don't bring out in public settings.
I was in Bergen-Belsen, of course, on the train, and it's very interesting. My family, we took great notice that there was an unusually high proportion of rabbis, sages, and Hasidic rabbis that Kasztner saved. In fact, my grandfather, who was the Rav of Strasshof, was the only rabbi for 18,000 Jews, told me that in the last month of the war, Kasztner organized 2 truckloads of Hasidic rabbis. Kasztner came to my grandfather, was Rabbi Tzvi Cohn, on my mother's side, and said, I want you to come too. But my grandfather said, listen, I'm the only rabbi. I'm not going to leave 18,000 Jews without a religious leader. And instead, he gave his seat to a baby who is today the Salem Rebbe in Brooklyn. And unusually high number of rabbis were saved. I always tell them there would be no Williamsburg today if not for Kasztner. Toda rabba.
One more question. One more question.
I was living in Israel 15 years, and I suffered that he was not the hero from the day when his family arrived. He was looking still and to save. And who has something to talk of Kasztner shall come to me. I will tell him what Kasztner was, and he is a hero. And thank you, family, that you don't forget him.
I think that impassioned statement really sums up this evening, and thank you for that statement. Seriously, reminded of the many faces of bravery, and we have been privileged tonight to share with the family, and thanks to Gaylen Ross for a remarkable documentary.